I want to start by welcoming you all to this annual workshop on renewal, tenure, continuing appointment, and promotion processes for QUFA faculty members at Queen's. This is part one of a two-part series of workshops that we run every year jointly, offered by the administration and the Faculty Association. And just to introduce who's at the front of the room, I'm John Dixon. I'm formerly the Associate VP Academic and International. Now I'm the Vice Provost International, but I'm still pressed into service for this purpose. And on the panel behind me, we have Phil Goldman, the QUFA Grievance Officer, Constance Adamson, the co-chair of the Joint Committee for Administration of the Agreement, the JCAA, on the QUFA side, and Doug Morrow, the Senior Associate in the Faculty Relations Group in the Office of the Provost. And the way we've run these in the past, and I guess with the agreement of the panel, the way we'll run it today is that I will sort of lead us through this and probably end up doing most of the talking from the front of the room. But the members on the panel are, of course, free and likely to interject at various points and contribute answers to questions. And I want to emphasize that we do want this to be as interactive as possible and answer your specific questions. In front of you, you should have 4 documents, or at least maybe 3. I guess you all have 4 documents. There's a pink package, which we will follow along primarily. This will be the main document that I referred to during the presentation, and it relates to procedures for renewal and tenure and promotion for regular faculty, and refers also to adjuncts. There's a green document that relates to librarians and archivists, and it is pretty much parallel to the faculty document, but has different article references. References to collective agreement articles. And I'm not going to refer specifically to the librarian and archivist document. The parallelism, I think, should enable the people from the library and archives here to follow along without a problem. The next thing you've got is a photocopy of Article 30, which is the collective agreement article on renewal, tenure, and promotion for tenure track and tenured faculty members. We didn't reproduce the Article 31, which deals with librarians and archivists, or Article 32, which deals with adjuncts, because there's not too much content in those that we need to refer to today. With respect to these processes, mostly they refer back to Article 30 for the process parts of it. And then the 4th document is a photocopy of a memorandum of agreement between...
John, they don't have that, actually.
The MOA? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. The MOA is not on your table. I thought it was. I misunderstood. There has been an MOA signed that clarifies the promotion criteria for adjuncts, and we will make reference to that when we get to that point. Okay, so I will start with, I'm going to put the green document down so that I don't confuse myself. Start with the pink document, and the first section makes some general, deals with some general issues. The first point being that the whole process and the criteria are governed by the collective agreement between the 2 parties, QUFA and the university, the current one being the 2008-2011 agreement, and that is effectively the code. We have to operate in accordance with that, both its spirit and its letter. If there are some ambiguities or questions that arise in committees or in departments during that process, then those should be put to either of the parties, the faculty relations group in the provost's office, or to QUFA for clarification and interpretation. The second point is that there are several other articles that have a bearing on these processes. I've mentioned Article 30, 31, and 32, which are the ones that deal specifically with criteria and process. But this point 2 on this page refers you also to Article 24, the article dealing with employment equity, 18, which deals with conflict of interest and conflict of commitment, and 29, which deals with assessment and evaluation of teaching. And so there are references in the RTP articles to those, and it's important that the committee members familiarize themselves with Articles 24, 18, and 29 before they start, because there's some important principles embodied there that you have to adhere to. So then point 3, an important point is that the members of the RTP or RCAP committees are not to participate in this process for any application for which they have a conflict of interest, or for which there's an apprehension of bias, maybe an apprehension of bias. And, so that's elaborated in Article 18. The parties over the years have come to the position that rather than having a member of a committee simply recuse themselves from the committee during the dealing with one particular file, instead of that, the person should actually not be on the committee at all in a given year, so that if there is a conflict of interest or a reasonable apprehension of bias about a member of the committee, and with respect to any file that's being dealt with by that committee, that member shouldn't be on the committee in that year. They should be replaced. We can talk a bit more about what is meant by conflict of interest and apprehension of bias. I guess and I expect I can count on help from the back of from the panel behind me. I think an important point is that a candidate may well want to make input into on this point, because the candidate may feel that there's a reasonable apprehension of bias. It's not, though, up to the candidate to it's not simply that if the candidate says, oh, there's apprehension of bias, that person has to be off. This is a decision that isn't in the hand of either the candidate or the person on the committee. It needs to be reviewed to see whether it's reasonable, and the same for conflict of interest. So if there is the possibility of these, that should be reported to, who is it? The head?
The head.
Oh yeah, okay, so the department head. And the department head examines the facts and makes the determination, and then advises the committee of whether the person should be off the committee or could stay on.
I should say something.
Go ahead, yeah.
Here, John, now that you moved aside, so my screen agent was going to be unhappy. When it says apprehension of bias, this is sometimes a difficult concept for people to get. I've never met an academic who believed that they were biased. And so people may think they can make unbiased decision. Apprehension has to do essentially with how the outside world would view the situation, and not what goes on in your soul. And so you have to, in a sense, put yourself outside of yourself and say, well, what would given the fact that I've had this conflict over the years with this candidate, it's not going to affect my ability to make a fair judgment, but what would other people think in these circumstances? And that's the kind of exercise you have to engage in. And I would recommend that people do engage in that kind of exercise, because it's much better to do that than have a candidate raise questions, because then that creates some difficulty in the RTP process, because then we're going to have to sort of work that thing out. And so if this can be done beforehand, that's all to the good.
Right. On the conflict of interest, of course, faculty members in a department know each other well, there's a high probability that they've taught together. There are a lot of research linkages and collaborations within departments. And if we strictly said, well, if you've worked with the person, you have a conflict of interest, that would obviously grind the whole process to a halt. And so it's not that strict
Right.
judgment, right?
No, conflict of interest is a somewhat different apprehension of bias. Conflict of interest, let me give you an example of a conflict of interest. You and the candidate have applied to insert for a grant 3 days ago. That's a conflict of interest. You and the candidate applied for a grant to insert 10 years ago. That's not a conflict of interest. All right?
The first scenario, particularly if it's a tenure application,
Yes.
because if the person does not succeed in the tenure application, that has major ramifications for your grant application.
That's right.
Maybe less so if it's an application to full professor, but I think what Phil's example is just an example, and all of these things are very specific fact driven, so that if you think there may be a situation of a conflict, raise it, as the CA says, with the head, and there'll be a lot of questions. You can explore it with the head to find out the nature of the involvement, and then a determination is made. It's very difficult right off the bat to say whether there's a conflict. So Phil's offered a good example, but you can't draw a rule out of that. Every case will be different.
I mean, there are some scenarios that are clearly a conflict right off the bat, and are the ones that actually are the easiest to avoid when the committee is being nominated and assembled. And those would be ones where there's a close personal relationship between a candidate and a committee member, such as they are a couple, for example. That just sort of by definition is a conflict of interest. And so, given that we know in advance who is expected to apply for renewal and for tenure, because those are timed processes, they're set in given years and known ahead of time. Someone who knows that their partner is due to apply should refuse to be nominated for the election. That's just a simple way of avoiding that possibility. Of course, candidacy for promotion to professor is up to the candidate and could be decided after the committee's been elected, and so that one's harder to avoid from the beginning. Okay, yeah.
If I could just point out, the conflict of interest article does lay out that you go to the head and so on, but in Article 30, and then the parallel in the librarian archivist article, is that committee members, and this is committee members and sort of anybody else involved with the process, may contact in total confidence either the Faculty Relations Office or QUFA if they have any questions. And it speaks to may disclose potential violations. Well, it's not as drastic as that. It's just if you have any kind of query and you just want to maybe run it by somebody, check it out, that kind of thing. These conflict of interest issues they're never simple. I mean, sometimes they are, but kind of rarely.
Sometimes they're not, right.
Yeah, and it often happens over the course of the summer that the JCAA co-chairs are working with the head or with the committee to actually rejig the committee because there are difficulties there. It does happen. We wish it didn't, but it does.
Okay, yeah.
Sure.
David.
Does this apprehension of conflict give the candidate the veto and the ability to throw anyone they don't think will vote against them off the committee?
So the question is, I got it. The question is, do these two possibilities of conflict of interest or reasonable apprehension of bias give the candidate a veto? And the answer is no.
Can the candidate write ahead and say, I believe this person is biased against me, remove them from the committee?
The head can, the question is, can the candidate write to the head or notify the head and express the belief of bias and ask for the person to be removed? Well, they can certainly right, and then it's up to the head per that Article 18 to do the determination and make the decision. And of course, if the candidate doesn't like that, the candidate can grieve, and also it could jeopardize the whole outcome of the process later on, because if the person is not replaced, the process proceeds. The candidate could raise it in a formal way through a grievance of the outcome of the process at the end of the day if the process turned out a negative decision.
I should add one clarification. It's not apprehension of bias, it's reasonable apprehension of bias. It's not a subjective issue. So, I can believe that all kinds of people are biased. But my belief is irrelevant in the larger scheme of things, and so you're going to have to provide some kind of persuasive scenario as to why this person providing a recommendation in this case would be seen to be prejudiced and having prejudged the issue, regardless of your belief.
Does that help?
You're going to get people who are going to claim bias all the time.
But in those circumstances, you've just been advised you're stupid not to take the person off the committee because they'll grieve and the whole thing will be thrown out.
Not necessarily. I mean, why would they? I mean, it depends on part of the outcome as to whether or not they're going to grieve.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that the person thinks there's bias, and lo and behold, there isn't, and the process produces a positive outcome. So there clearly wasn't. Okay, I think we better move on. But is that, yeah?
If I may, I was just going to say that sometimes those situations arise, and what happens is the head or somebody will speak to faculty relations and QUFA, and they can sort it out ahead of time rather than it going through the whole process. And so if there is any question and the head disagrees with the candidate, for example, then they can take it to QUFA, faculty relations, and they can sort it out so that it doesn't have to go through the whole process before it's decided.
Did that sound get picked up? Okay. Okay, so let's move on to point 4 on this general section. All members of RTP and RCAP committees have to complete the equity training offered by the Office of University Advisor on Equity before reviewing the files. And I hope everyone who's involved has had that, but if not, they should be finding out what the schedule of the training is and making sure they get the training before the review process starts in the fall. And there's a note of clarification on the bottom of the page there that says that this requirement also applies to student members of the committee. And I know sometimes that's problematic for departments when the student member isn't identified until the return of students in the fall, but that's the way it is. So student members are equally obliged to have the training. If they object, one could point out that it's a good part of their professional training for the rest of their lives to have some formal training in equity issues. Turning the page, number 5 speaks to employment equity, and I won't dwell on this. There is a quote from the Article 24 there. I don't know if you want to add anything, but I think if people read that, it should be self-evident. Point 6 makes the point that members have the right to grieve a negative decision. That the grievance, it's a decision that is grieved, and so the decision that we're dealing with here is whether the person gets renewed, is granted tenure, or is granted promotion. And that decision is taken at the end of the process. There isn't a decision as such up until that point. There's a chain of recommendations. Granted, in running the process, I guess one could say there are a bunch of little decisions about which referees to pick and so on, but but those are decisions not taken by people who can be grieved. So it's only deans and above who can be grieved. So it's the outcome at the end of the day that it's grievable. Point 7 deals with tenure track faculty, making the point that applications for tenure and promotion to associate go together, and the criteria are the same. You know, they are the tenure criteria that also carry promotion with them. And the point that failure to be awarded a tenured appointment results in a terminal appointment of 1 year. And then point 8 is not really germane to the discussion today, but it just speaks to the application by term adjuncts for continuing adjunct status. That's a process that's adjudicated by or dealt with by the same committee, but not through the same process and not on the same timeline. So it's not really that relevant to our discussion here today. Okay, so turning to page 3, this is a kind of a guide to the rest of the pink or green document that you have in front of you, and you'll note there that it speaks to the 2 parts of the workshop. Part 1, spring session, that's what we're in now, and then the part 2 being the fall session. The rest of this document comprises 5 tables, and we are going to go through the first 3 of those tables, each of which has a number of elements that are different parts of the process and have different article references. And so as we work our way through those, we'll point out some salient points and some specific article references. Okay, so let's move on to page 4, table 1. And you'll see, just to explain the structure of the table, you'll see there are 5 vertical columns and a number of blocks of rows. And so the first column on the left-hand side, headed topic, kind of breaks the whole process down into little subsections or topics that we're going to talk about. The second column, deadline, you'll find as we go through here that there are 2 types of deadline. One being a deadline that is written in regular face type and underlined, and some that are written in italics. Have I got it right?
Yes, there's a footnote on the bottom.
Oh yeah, right, okay. So a date in upright font is one that is actually specified as a hard date in the collective agreement. The ones that are in italics are simply recommended dates that, if followed, would help you to keep on track with the timeline in order to be able to meet the specified dates. The third column, item complete, is really there as a kind of a checklist for committees and heads to keep track of where you are in the process to make sure that you've done all of the requisite required elements. Then columns 4 and 5 are the specific article references. The column 4 relating to tenure track and tenured faculty. Column 5 to adjuncts, promotion. Okay, so that's the structure going across the table. Going down the table, we have large blocks headed by boldface titles and then separate lines that deal with the specific subtopics. So I'll move on then in table 1 to talk about the committee. And you'll see there is a hard date in column 2, May 1st, and the provision is that the committee has to be elected by May 1st. Each year there's a provision in the collective agreement that each committee has to have at least 3 members elected from the bargaining unit. And so that's what, there's also provision for other members from outside the unit and possibly members from outside the bargaining unit. That's discussed in Articles 30.2.1 and 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 and so on. I don't think I need to dwell too much on that unless there's a question. the role of the committee, that, I don't know why that only refers to adjuncts, 30.5. Anyone remember? That doesn't seem to make sense. Because that 30.5 speaks to eligibility. So anyway, let's not worry about that.
It may be, John, that the RTP committee deals with promotion applications for adjuncts and for applications for continuing. The article reference is a mystery, but perhaps that's why there's a reference there, and it may be 32.5.1 is what it should be.
Could,
double check
possibly. The point is that most of the personnel processes that relate to term adjuncts are done by the appointments committee. So like appointment and then reappointment and so on. Yeah. The only one that relates to continuing adjuncts.
I think the reference there should be 32.5.1,
Okay.
which reads, the renewal tenure promotion committee, as defined in Article 30.2, shall make recommendations on all adjunct promotion applications. So that's a bit of a typo there. It should read 32.5.1. It's on the line reading roll, and it should read 32.5.1.
Conflict of interest is covered specifically in Article 30.2.5, and that has the reference to Article 18. I don't think we need to go into that anymore. We already covered it quite detailed, in a detailed way. Confidentiality, it's essential that these processes be carried out in a confidential way, and committee members are bound by confidentiality during the deliberations and in the decision and afterwards as well. And if there is a violation, then the person who violates that confidentiality is to be removed from the committee. An important point, though, is that notwithstanding confidentiality, if there's a concern about violation of the agreement, that can be brought to the attention of QUFA or an appropriate university officer without, that would not be a violation of confidentiality for a committee member to bring a concern forward, or indeed to bring a question that is context specific forward. If they're bringing it to faculty relations or the QUFA grievance officer, that's clearly not a conflict or not a breach of the confidentiality.
Can I just absolutely underscore the importance of confidentiality? It is no small thing. Breaches of confidentiality can do so much damage to candidates, to people serving on committees, and to the whole process. It's not something to be taken lightly. I'm sure Phil would echo the notion that it's something that must be taken very seriously.
To be more specific, there are different kinds of confidentiality. There's the kind of confidentiality which, you speak to the world, you speak to your partner, you speak to other members of the department, you speak to the candidate. And then there's a situation where, for example, you speak to the next level above you. So the chair of the committee speaks to the head prior to the decision being made. That is a no-no, because we have our protocol is that the head sees the file, and the full file, including the committee's recommendation, for the first time when it arises on her or his desk, and doesn't even open it until the member has had an opportunity to respond to the committee recommendation. And this is the one area of confidentiality which seems for people not to quite understand. They understand confidentiality with respect to someone who's not part of the process, but they don't quite understand confidentiality with respect to the levels, and the levels are very important.
And that's a point where I could mention that you know, what the role of me or my successor is in this process. The role that I've played in the past has been to offer these workshops, and I do get asked questions about general principles and processes and so on. But as someone who, in the course of the review later on, as the file comes to the on its way from the dean to the principal, I don't want to know any details about a specific case, and so I always refuse to talk to anyone who calls about with a procedural or a case-specific question, and refer it to faculty relations or QUFA. My role in future will be played by the deputy provost rather than me, but the same principle will apply, that it would be fair game to ask a process question that is sort of not obviously related to a specific case, but we don't want to be contaminated by knowledge of a specific case until the file is complete. Yep.
A question about membership. There doesn't seem to be any accommodation in the CA for an applicant that's a joint appointment, either within a faculty or across. So they seem to be an ad hoc sort of makeup when they come up. Is there any?
So the question is, how do we deal with appointees who hold joint appointments? And you're right, the agreement doesn't go into a lot of detail about that. And over the years, we've dealt with these on a case-by-case basis, although we are supposed to actually work out the arrangements of those in advance when the person is appointed, and the specifics are supposed to be agreed and laid out in the letter of appointment, so the person knows up front that when you come up for renewal, your renewal application will be judged in this way by a sort of a hybrid process. We've started to do a better job of that, but there's been a number of cases this year, some of them that touch on your department, I know, that slipped through the cracks and didn't get that elucidation in the appointment letter. So when that does happen, QUFA and the university, through the JCAA actually, work out a protocol that would be used. So it's either, there are a range of possibilities. One is a completely unique committee that's made of members from both departments. Another is to have the process come up in parallel through both departments and to the dean from the two heads separately, or two committees to the heads jointly, and the heads jointly make a recommendation. There's a variety of ways that it can be handled, but those should be ironed out and agreed to and approved by the JCAA like at this time of year, if it wasn't done beforehand. Do you want to add anything, JCAA? It's
referred to as a non-standard committee, and we generally draw up an MOA, a memorandum of agreement, so it is just laid out that's very clear. This is especially important when it's, let's say, a renewal, because then, of course, the same person will be dealing with a tenure committee a few years on. And generally, it's members of the existing RTP committees in one department, supplemented by some representatives from the other department, or members from both committees, or whatever seems to suit the circumstances. And generally, this is worked out by the head, and then comes to the co-chairs of the JCAA, and we just ensure that it fits with. There's a fair amount of past practice on this. Yeah. It is done all the time, but the phrase to use is that, hey, I need to have a non-standard committee approved. Alan?
25.2.1.1 deals with joint appointments and refers back to the letter of appointment, where there can be an allocation of responsibility.
Yeah, it's a rare letter of appointment that has actually laid out these processes and provided guidance for you for the future.
I guess
But
I have to bear the guilt for that.
I mean, it depends on people's research interests and so on. You want to make sure that it's an appropriate and fair committee, and that reflects the relationship of the individual member with the departments that they are attached to.
So yeah, I mean, in defense of not having it in the letter, these circumstances can change over the 3 to 6 years from the time of appointment to the time of the non-standard process being needed. So.
We had this experience last year. It wasn't a question of principle, that the principle was met. This was a tenure promotion case with a joint appointed person. It was the bureaucracy that became very problematic. And there was great confusion between the two units about who was responsible for what in terms of letters of reference and getting student input. So my recommendation is, I think the principles on this ad hoc basis might be working fine, but the bureaucracy needs to be ironed out somewhere where if there is an ad hoc committee established, that someone very clearly stipulates which unit's going to run basically the groundwork, the footwork that is required in these processes.
Was that picked up? Sound picked up? Yeah.
We actually did that exact thing through a non-standard appointments committee and laid out for both renewal and tenure what each department was responsible for doing, and it worked very well. So, yeah, no, we did get that laid out. So it's a good suggestion, and I think we didn't have problems because it was step by step laid out.
Yeah, that's why the JCAA is actually doing this as MOAs, because it does lay out.
That's what we had.
Both unit heads will and so on.
Including it in the binder, the RTP binder that goes through the process, so that everybody's clear what took place.
Including the people that will read the file as it works through the process much later. So including the principal when it lands on his desk. Yeah.
So, moving on, the next line deals with equity representative and equity responsibilities as referred to in where 30.2.3, no, there's something wrong with these numbers.
No, that's fine. And
oh yeah, there is, that's right, there's a cross-reference. The member shall appoint a member as the committee's equity rep per Article 24. And then it brings in the reference to the whole of Article 24, which spells out the principles to be adhered to. The next line says RTP committees for members in clinical departments in the Faculty of Health Sciences, and there's a section 30.3 that deals with that. There's a provision for a member in a committee in a department that is largely a non-QUFA department. Excuse me. There are some departments where the majority of the members are clinicians, and only one or a small number of members are QUFA members and governed by this process. And so there's a provision there for the member to identify a process and membership to be on the committee and make this recommendation. And those people who have some knowledge of the members' work don't necessarily have to be QUFA members. And again, if there's disagreement there, then that gets referred to the JCAA for a decision. And then finally, the next step being line being remedial processes. This is very important. It does happen that a committee, for some reason, fails to follow the procedures that are set out, and for that, in that circumstance, some sort of remedial measure has to be determined in order to get the process back on track, and that's to be approved by the JCAA, but there is a section, Appendix D in the agreement, that deals a bit with this, so that's the first place to look if a problem like this arises. And then the final point in that block on the committee, on table 1, talks about the committee members' sort of eligibility to participate in the recommendation. It's very important that any committee member who will actually participate in the final deliberation and contribute to the recommendation has to have taken part in the whole process and has to have actually reviewed the file. It's not a matter of just dropping in for the last meeting and chipping in your 2 cents worth to influence the outcome. You have to be a full participant. And that means, granted, there are difficulties with scheduling meetings sometimes. Faculty do travel, they're out of town, and so on. There's nothing in here that says that meetings cannot include teleconferences, though. So bearing that in mind, you may well find that in some circumstances a teleconference with a member who's in a hotel in Vancouver at 5:30 in the morning is the only way to have that member participate in a deliberation in order to maintain the ability to contribute to the outcome. Okay? So moving on then to the next block, which is eligibility of candidates, and this is spelled out in 30.5 in Article 30, and the essential feature being that to be considered for renewal, a faculty member would be in the final year of the initial tenure track appointment. Those are usually 3-year appointments, and therefore the person is usually expected to be applying for renewal in the fall of the 3rd year. That is, after they've been here for 2 years and a bit. And it is possible for a member to be considered for renewal earlier than that, but that scenario comes up very rarely. There would have to be a good reason for that, and the agreement to proceed that way has to be granted by the dean before it starts. Likewise, someone applying for tenure would normally be someone who's in the final year of a renewed tenure track appointment, i.e. in the normal career track they would be in the 6th year. They will have completed 5 years and a bit when they apply. And in a similar way, parallel way, someone in that situation could apply earlier than the 6th year. That does happen more often. A candidate who feels that they are really on track, they've got everything completely under control, they've got a great research record, and the teaching evidence is really good, they may make a case, let's get this over with and get me over the hurdle sooner, but the dean has to agree. I think that, personally, I think that it's not a great idea to do that. I think people are better to let the 5.5 years go by before they apply to make sure everything's solid. I've seen a number of cases where someone applies a year early, and lo and behold, it's not as smooth sailing as they might have liked. So, to my mind, there would need to be a really compelling reason to do that, and it's a good idea to mentor people to take the time to make sure they've got a really solid file before they apply for tenure.
Yeah, with respect to an extension, the collective agreement provides for additional time, for example, for women on maternity leave. There's a variety of leaves which you're entitled to an extension. And the one thing I would like to point out here, and it's sometimes not adhered to by committees, is that because the person has been on a designated leave, does not mean they've had more time. This happens too often. Just because a woman has had a child doesn't mean she's had more time to do the work. So the extension has to be interpreted in terms of we've given everyone 6 good years.
Right. It's not just women who give birth, it's parents or people.
No, John.
People who become.
My mother told me.
The provision covers both sexes. It says a member who has become a parent.
Yes.
So. And there are other reasons for postponement as well. So sick leave and other, in fact, other reasons such as some very or unexpected, unavoidable, and disruptive delay in a research career, such as very late delivery of equipment or something like that, could be a good reason. And so that's the provision in 30.5.6, which says in other exceptional cases, members may request consideration be delayed 1 year. And the university is under the obligation to give those considerations those requests due consideration. So we can't just say, oh no, forget it, that's silly. You have to actually think carefully about it. That's not up to the committee. That's up to the head and the dean to deal with. And indeed, letters which grant extensions come from, in the system that we've had up until this year, come from the principal because they are extensions of appointment and changes to the terms of appointment, so the letter comes from the top. Okay. So that those provisions for delay apply to both renewal and tenure. I don't think we need to talk about the eligibility for continuing adjunct appointment because that's not part of the topic of our workshop today. So criteria, and moving on to our 30.6, there are separate criteria for renewal, for tenure and promotion, and for promotion of adjuncts, and promotion to full professor. And those are set out. And notice, well, 30.6.1 deals with renewal. You'll note that as we go through these, the criteria are progressive. The bar gets higher as one goes along. So for renewal, it's simply a record as a good teacher and clear evidence of high quality scholarly or creative work, normally but not necessarily demonstrated by presentation or publication in a suitable academic forum. It also clarifies that writing with respect to pedagogy and innovative teaching is counted as scholarly activity, and so on. There is not a specific reference to service for the renewal decision, given that people in that initial tenure track period are expected to be given a lighter than normal load of service, or if any. The presumption for renewal is in favor of renewal, and the university would have to demonstrate the weight of evidence goes against it. Tenure, the criteria are higher, the bar is higher. The record of teaching is record as a very good teacher, committed to academic and pedagogical excellence, record of high quality and peer-assessed expert peer-assessed scholarly or creative work, and so on and so forth. And the third one being a record of professional university or community service. So we have the three elements brought in now for tenure, and also the onus shifts for the tenure decision. The onus is on the member to show that the evidence favors the granting of tenure. And then 30.6.5 speaks to promotion, and 36.6 it gives the specific criteria. So assistant professor promotions don't happen very often because most people come in as assistant professors if they have the degree of the expected professional degree of PhD. Unless they, well, and indeed not a PhD if they're in a field where that's not the terminal degree, such as perhaps fine art or something like that. But so, and often someone who doesn't have a PhD but is in a field where that's expected might be appointed with kind of at the ABD state, that is all but dissertation state, in which case they'd probably be appointed as a lecturer, but with a proviso in their letter of appointment that upon completion of the PhD, they're converted to assistant professor automatically or pro forma. So that doesn't involve a review process. In effect, the rank was granted in advance pending the completion of the degree. So that doesn't entail work by the RTP committee. For promotion for associate professor in 36.6b, it just simply cross-references and says that the promotion to associate uses the tenure criteria. And then I want to dwell a bit more on the promotion to professor in Part C of 30.6.6. There's a duality here. The bar is definitely higher, and there's a duality between the scholarly work and the teaching. Two possibilities. Either combine scholarly and creative work judged to be distinguished together with very good teaching, or continuing high quality scholarly work with exceptional contributions to teaching. And then it goes on to talk about service. It's important for committees and the head and indeed the dean to recognize that the two possible combinations of those criteria and specify in the recommendation which one they think applies to a particular candidate. So are they saying the person qualifies for promotion to full because of distinguished scholarly work and very good teaching, or continuing high quality scholarly work and exceptional teaching? I mean, it's also possible for someone to be distinguished in scholarly work and exceptional in teaching. That's fine too. You can say that. But as a minimum, they have to meet the distinguished scholarly work and very good teaching, or the other. And you need to say that. If you simply say that the person has very good teaching and continuing high quality scholarly work, technically that does not meet the criteria. Okay? So I don't want to beat this horse, but please bear that in mind when you're constructing or making the judgment and constructing the letter, the recommendation.
John?
Yeah. Sorry.
Does the university keep statistics on quantifiable levels of excellence, like impact factors or H-index?
The university doesn't. Sorry, repeat the question. Does the university keep records of quantifiable factors such as impact factors and so on? No. But these are put forward sometimes by a candidate in their file, sometimes by referees with respect to a specific individual.
This has been an issue that rises annually in different files. The collective agreement talks only about the quality of research. The people who are primarily responsible for assessing the quality of the research are the external referees. They are expected to read and review the quality of that research. What you're talking about are things which are essentially proxies. And it's the association's position that reliance on proxies, in a sense, deviates from the requirement that focus be placed on the actual material submitted, because you can have some articles submitted to and published in very good journals which are terrible articles, and vice versa. And so it doesn't, in a sense, that's entirely secondary, in a distant second, given our focus on what is actually produced. And also, proxies vary enormously from field to field. In some of the humanities, there really are no proxies to speak of in the conventional way.
I think, too, the impact factor in particular, it probably applies. It's more readily measurable in established fields that have a long history. So in emerging areas of scholarship, there probably are not measures like that, and there probably are not venues for publication that would score high on the impact factor score of the journals of a more traditional, or shall I say, central discipline. So we have to be very careful to assess the work that the individual actually did, judged by people who are qualified to judge that work, and it may not be mainstream stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm just for my own curiosity, the thing that seems absent from this description is granting and success at granting. And I'm just curious about how that factors in.
I mean, again, I guess that's sort of a proxy. I mean, I guess one would say, well, if you've been successful in getting grants, you probably did work that was good enough to impress the panel that adjudicated the grant application. But the point here is we're supposed to be looking at the work itself, not these secondary measures of the work.
I should say something about the granting. You can have the same piece of work or same proposal submitted to the granting agency 1 year and then the next. It's the same piece of work. 1 year they don't get the grant, the other year they do get the grant. It has nothing to do with the quality of that work, but it may have to do with the quality of other kinds of work that are submitted that year to a granting agency that only has a limited budget. And so our concern would be that you farm out the assessment of the quality of research to an external body like the MRC or INSERT and the like. I mean, it doesn't, let me put it this way, it does not hurt your application if you got a grant. But the fact that you don't have a grant doesn't necessarily hurt your application also. And there are some fields where grants are not essential to the production of scholarship.
Right. Yeah, I think it's we try to each of these processes should be evaluating the candidates and the candidates' work. There isn't any kind of any hint of a process that says that only a certain proportion should be successful. Well, you know, in granting councils, only a proportion will be successful because there's only so much money. Granted, the ones that are successful probably are better, but hopefully are better. But as Phil says, the bar is kind of a movable bar that is it's a relative bar rather than looking at the actual work of that individual in isolation.
I appreciate the thoughts.
Okay. Okay, criteria. I guess I wanted to speak to the line, the second to last line on that page, the continuing adjunct appointment. This is the one that, oh no, I'm sorry, I don't want it. It's not the second to last line, it's promotion, it's the last line. Specifically, the article references regarding promotion of adjunct faculty. But I made reference to a memorandum of agreement that was signed by the parties in April of this year, which clarifies, or well, it modifies what's in the collective agreement, hopefully clarifying what it originally intended to say. And Doug, do you want to walk through this? Because you have more to do with it than I do.
Essentially what it says is, and I should just say that this article, you're not going to find it in the print edition of the collective agreement, but if you go online, it's certainly on the faculty relations website, there is a link to it from Article 32.5.2. You'll find the link and it'll take you to this memorandum of agreement. And essentially what it says is that the criteria for promotion of adjuncts shall be, is the criteria that's set out in Article 30.6.1 through Article 30.6.7. So it refers you to the criteria that is applicable to assistant professor, associate professor, and full professor. So it says, those criteria shall apply to the same extent and in the same way that they apply to tenured and tenure-track faculty members, except that when considering the length of time over which an adjunct has developed his or her record of scholarly activity, the committee shall take into consideration any evidence as to the effect of the nature of the academic appointment held by the adjunct on his or her ability to engage in those scholarly activities. So, you know, when you're up for tenure, you're looking at the scholarly activity that's taken place over a fixed period of time. And so that much is a constant, and then it's easy to get a sense of the person's productivity and the evolution of the quality of the work. When you're talking about the promotion of an adjunct, because that person doesn't or may not have had research and scholarly work as part of their appointment, you know, the expectation that they would engage in scholarly activity to the same, you know, extent at the same rate over that period of time shouldn't be there. So if the period is longer, you're to take that into account and any aspects of the appointment that might have affected that person's ability to generate the scholarly work. But essentially, you're evaluating the scholarly work according to the same bar, the same measure, and that's the important point.
Okay, questions? Yeah.
So is this, if you're looking at clinical factors going forward for promotion, is it a similar sort of understanding there?
The question was whether the same applies to clinical faculty. Clinical faculty are dealt with under a completely different set of documents, the Senate document, and so that's a whole other ball of wax.
They refer back to a lot of these documents as well. I mean, that's most of the
clinical faculty documents don't refer to these. Some of the language is parallel, but that's because they're both inherited actually from earlier. Well, indeed, the Senate document that governs the clinical faculty has evolved and been modified a bit, but is the roots of a lot of the stuff in the collective agreement. But the two regimes are completely separate.
However, I think there are some bargaining unit faculty, particularly in clinical-oriented departments, that have work profiles that are quite different from what you might find in arts and science. And so what the person is evaluated on is that person's work profile. So the person may have 80% research and very little teaching, for example, very little service. So so that's the, that's what the committees look at. That profile, they don't apply the sort of typical work profile that you would see elsewhere in the university. So and the collective agreement provides for that.
If you meant QUFA members in clinical departments who hold appointments that are more on the clinical side, yeah, this document applies. I'm not sure in hindsight.
I'm getting with both, but
yeah.
It's really hard to get a handle on the clinical side. It's not terribly clear, and some of them are going forward for promotion this year.
Right.
And I'll have to go back and read the documents, but so sorry.
Right, I wouldn't turn to these documents, the collective agreements, for elucidation on how to deal with non-QUFA clinical people. That's a separate discussion, and you can talk to the Vice Dean and us for clarification as needed, but I wouldn't rely on cross-reference to the QUFA collective agreement for non-QUFA members. Okay.
Yes, just one small comment. You may also find it useful to contact CTAC, Clinical Teachers Association of Queens, and they have an advocate, Michael Singer, who essentially plays the same role I do, and he may also be able to provide some information on that process.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
I'm just wondering, John, whether you, or somebody, can clarify that this is about, you were talking about promotion of adjunct faculty rather than the process for gaining that category. status. So for example, the employment category of continuing adjunct
Yeah.
is now separated from this promotion rank. If you could just clarify that.
Right, fair enough. So the relationship between applying for continuing adjunct status and promotion of a term adjunct or continuing adjunct to a rank of advanced beyond associate or assistant is two different things. The promotion in itself, change of rank, is something we're talking about here, and that's what that MOA relates to. What are the criteria for the change in rank? The change in category from term adjunct to continuing adjunct is a different kettle of fish. It is dealt with by the Renewal, Tenure, and Promotion Committee, but according to a different process that's laid out in Article 32 and is not something we're talking about here. Is that sufficiently clear?
That's sufficient. I just wanted to, because for so many years they were tied, and some people may have a remnant of that memory, and so I want to make sure that it's clear that they're apart.
Right. It used to be, up until this particular collective agreement, it used to be that a term adjunct who was promoted who sought and was promoted to associate would be made a continuing adjunct. Well, those two have been separated now, and the change in rank is based on accomplishment, and the change in category of appointment is based essentially on satisfactory service, teaching a certain number of courses over a certain number of years. And that brings us, unless there's another question, that brings us to the end of Table 1, and we're slightly more than halfway through, so I think we should stop now for our coffee break. We come back in about 5 or 6 minutes. Thank you. So there are provisions for notifying candidates to make sure that everyone who's affected by these processes knows about them and knows about the timelines. The fundamental deadline is August 15th, which is the date by which the people who are applicants will have their files submitted to the process, and so we have to make sure candidates know about that. There's several steps. One is a note published in the Gazette. That was unfortunately messed up a bit this year because of reasons that we don't need to go into. I think it's been rectified now through various steps, but hopefully that's been taken care of to the satisfaction of all concerned. There's also a provision for notification in the department. The head is supposed to notify members both of the application deadline and also of the very fact of the Gazette notice. Then the next important date, which is yet to happen, is the member who plans to apply has to notify the head of that by July 1st, and that's a hard deadline. So this is to allow the committee and the department and also the rest of the process to really get a handle on what the workload will be for that year. For at least that's one aspect of it. So the candidate has to declare by July 1st that they indeed will be a candidate for one of these processes. And then as soon as that information is available, the head notifies the RTP committee of that list of candidates within the department, and that certainly helps the RTP committee to plan its work. If there are no applicants, well, that's obviously the committee's happy. If there are 6 or 8, they will have a big job to plan their work for the next 6 months. And as soon as the information of or how many candidates there are is available, the committee needs to start planning its meetings. So that's pretty straightforward. Any questions about that? Has everyone done the notifications within the departments? Has anyone not? Okay. That's good. Will anyone fess up publicly? No. Okay. All right. Let's move to Table 3, which starts on page 6. And one of the first and one of the important steps in this process that indeed happens before the candidate has submitted their application. Maybe I should pause here to clarify some terminology. I'm going to refer to the application file and the RTP file. The application file is the package of material that a candidate assembles and puts forward to support their case. The RTP file is the whole file which grows as the process goes along. It includes the candidate's application file, but then it also includes referee letters, student letters, colleague letters, material from the official file. I guess that's probably just about it, but you know, so, and then it also includes the recommendation letters from the committee and from the head as the process goes on. So I'll try to keep my use of the terminology straight. Application file only refers to what the applicant provides. RTP file is the whole thing that is being progressively assessed at the various levels. So even before the application file is in, the work starts on soliciting the referees, and we need to talk about the number of referees required for each case, criteria, and so on. So the number of referees required varies by process. The CA specifies that a renewal file is to include letters from 3 referees, 2 of which, I think it's at least one of which is external to the university. At the tenure and promotion to associate level, the number of referees required is 4, of which 1 may be internal and 3 have to be external. And then for promotion to professor, the number of referee letters required is 5, of which 1 may be internal to the university. Internal to the university means both internal to the department and outside the department. So it could be that an official referee is selected from among the department's members, or it could be someone else from within the walls of Queen's. So you know, it's the CA is explicit in saying from external to Queen's. That means exactly what it says. And the files, when they are dealt with, they have to include exactly those numbers. It doesn't mean if the full process says 5, oh well, 6 would be better. That's not what it means. It means 5, not 4, not 6, but 5. And if in the process of receiving the referee letters, a referee who promised to submit one didn't, well, you can't deal with the file until you replace that letter by a letter from another referee. And so there's sometimes some delay in toing and froing as the requisite number of letters is accumulated. The point of having exactly the number for a process specified is sort of to level the playing field.
What we've found in the last 2 years of running promotion and tenure applications is that we're having to generate longer and longer lists of potential referees, because we're going to referees who say, I can't do anymore, I've got 10 I'm doing this year, I can't do anymore. And we're chunking down the list. We've gone through lists, which has thrown us into a very ad hoc process of creating new lists, which has become, I would argue, problematic in the sense of full consultation with the candidate and the head. And I'm raising all of this along with another question about the head's role in the referee list making and contacting the referees. And I'm wondering if it does not make more sense that the chair of the committee does that.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether I need to repeat that. You didn't get it all. Okay, so the question is a rising problem, at least in this department, about non-response by referees or unwillingness by referees to be referees, and running out of a list and needing a longer list and so on. And then the issue of the role of the head, and it's an added complication if this dialogue is going on between the committee and the member about who the referees should be, and then it's the head's responsibility to actually communicate with referees, and recommendation being made that it should be the committee chair who does that. I mean, first off, all I can say is the CA says what the CA says. I'm not in a position here to change it on the fly.
I'm putting it out as it's not an ad hoc situation. This is 5 files, 2 years, many different, varied disciplines. It's not like this is one type of expert we're seeking. And I would argue that this is going to be an increasing problem as faculty numbers go down and more is asked of faculty this time.
I mean, I must say, having read all the files last year and in recent years, there is evidence of this problem, but I wouldn't say it's widespread. I mean, I can't actually remember which departments. No, but the file, but the file records that.
The problem is we're asked to seek high-quality referees, right? You want established academics who are going to referee. So you go for the stars. They very quickly say no. And then you go to Team League B and so on and so on. But you're seeing the people we got.
No, but the file should contain the paper trail of all of that stuff. So.
And you're getting all the lists.
Yeah.
But my concern is the procedure. My concern is how those lists ultimately get generated and is there full consultation. That's my concern.
I don't know whether there is there should be, but whether there is another matter.
Fine. Like we were trying to make the deadlines and get someone to have time enough to read the files carefully. You were really informed and see our hands.
John, and I would just add, particularly on Phil's comment about the director or the unit head not being involved at all in the process.
Exactly.
That's where you get into the problems, because in fact you do get involved because the letters are going out under your name, so you know who's being asked, and you then are asked to meet again with the candidates to regenerate lists.
Yeah.
So it just, and it just raised a flag when Phil mentioned that was the one, you had to be really careful that the unit head wasn't involved, because they should be seeing the final file. So in fact, that is happening. You don't see the letters when they come back, but you are involved in the process.
But the role of the head is spelled out as appropriate at that stage in the collective agreement. So I don't think we don't have
any problem there.
Draw a distinction between offline dialogue between the committee chair and the head later on, when the committee chair casually tells the head, we're concerned about this file and this and this and this, and they haven't reached their final decision yet. That's inappropriate. Talking about who the referees are is not part of the adjudication process. It's part of assembling the file. But, I sympathize. I don't know what
I think it is. I think, especially when Phil's comment was, you shouldn't be having sidebar discussions around the adjudication. Well, you've already had discussions sometimes 2 and 3 times, as you have to keep regenerating lists.
I think there's a distinction to be made between essentially preliminary procedural matters and substantive assessment on the file. I think initially, as I recall, the reason for the head taking part, the head is available, often the chair. It's a summertime, and well, who knows? Maybe not. Well, the heads are not supposed to have summers. But so the member candidate has, normally deals with the head. It's sometimes it's just easier to have the head have this conversation as part of the head's mentoring role in the department to discuss possible candidates. But the head is not selecting or proposing necessarily candidates. It's the committee that draws up its own list, and it's the candidate that draws up their list. And so if you involve the head in further communication with respect to other candidates, I don't think that's a serious matter if the head has in fact been the person initially who has been contacting the person. I think it would be better to just clarify the roles here. The head has a responsibility for communicating with the outside world, and the chair is focused on internal processes.
I think one possible reason for it having been spelled out that the head is the one who's supposed to invite the referees is the head is an official of the department and perhaps might get a better response if you get as a person getting a letter from another university. If you get a letter from an official as opposed to just someone identified as the chair of a committee, you may respond a bit more. I don't know whether that was
also
a factor.
Thought, yes.
But so Yeah. So I mean, I think this is an issue that we can flag for the parties to examine when they do the next round of bargaining. But as it stands, we're living with this 0811 CA, and we're not in a position here to change it, except to sympathize. Yeah.
I don't see the situation changing much.
Good. Okay, so the numbers, that deals with the numbers. We're going to have a serious time crunch here. It speaks to criteria of for referees in 30.8.5, and so there are 4 elements to that. They must be suitably qualified with expertise in the candidate's discipline. They must be impartial. They must be appropriate, and they must be capable of making an assessment. And those could involve a bit of interpretation, but I think the point is you do want high-quality referees who are experts in their field, capable of making an assessment. Effectively means available and willing. So that's the point you're making. And it also speaks to that clause to where appropriate they should have international stature. This does not mean they must be non-Canadians or located outside Canada, but they should have a stature that's recognized beyond Canada if appropriate and possible. And then they shall be at arm's length from the candidate. Well, we always have a bit of a discussion here about what arm's length means. I guess there are no hard and fast rules, but one could summarize by saying, well, that means there shouldn't be a conflict of interest, there shouldn't be a reasonable apprehension of bias, and there shouldn't be an element of the referee being asked to evaluate their own work. So if they're a recent collaborator of the person or a co-applicant on a reasonably current grant or something such as that, they should not be referees. At the junior levels, at the renewal level in particular, we sometimes see the PhD supervisor being asked, well, they don't necessarily have a conflict of interest because, I mean, they might or they might not. That's a hard call, but I don't think we've ever systematically worried about ruling former PhD supervisors out at the early stage. Later on, as someone progresses through their career, they should hopefully have developed a much more independent research profile and should be able to, it should be possible to find suitable and qualified referees who have nothing to do with the former training of the person.
Let me identify 1 or 2 issues that tend to arise on a regular basis. First, it doesn't matter that the candidate and the referees know each other. It would be surprising that they wouldn't know each other, because that would sort of say the candidate probably doesn't go to enough conferences. It shouldn't matter necessarily that both the candidate and the referee have had their work published in a collected volume. It shouldn't necessarily matter that the referee has been the editor of a volume that has included the candidate's work necessarily. These kinds of relationships are fairly common in the academic world. What we're dealing with is a situation where, to a large extent, the referee has an academic or personal interest in the success or failure of the applicant, which could arise because they have been co-authors. It could arise for all kinds of other reasons, but arm's length is something that has to be dealt with very carefully. So ongoing collaboration one way or another with the person is a problem, but beyond that you have to make individual assessments, and there are no hard and fast rules.
And there is provision in the collective agreement for disclosure of relationships between the candidate and the potential referees. So candidates are well, they will be identifying a number of potential referees, and together with that list, they should be listing what the past relationships or current relationships with those individuals are or were. And then when the committee comes up with its list of names, the candidate gets an opportunity to both comment on those, but also to disclose any kinds of connections. And this all happens before the committee actually selects the individuals who will in fact be asked to be referees. This is just the list of potential referees that we're talking about at this stage. Okay, so criteria. So the first step is head meets with applicant by July 15th to discuss potential referees and also to go through the whole process of preparing the application. The first part of that is we've kind of talked about in the context of the questions that were asked. So the head should give the candidate some ideas of what these criteria that we read out mean, and guide the applicant in thinking about people with appropriate qualifications to put forward. And then the second part, preparation of the application, that's an opportunity to mentor the candidate about the whole process, what's appropriate in the teaching dossier, and answer any other questions the candidate might have. So the members' list of referees is due by July 31st. So the members are expected to submit a list of potential referees that is longer than the total number that will eventually be required. So in the case of renewal, that means the candidate has to submit at least 4 names. For tenure, it's 5, and for promotion to professor, it's at least 6 names. They could produce a longer list, that's fine, and it sounds like that would be a helpful thing to do in departments where this problem of refusals is arising. Okay, so that list comes in, and together with the disclosure of relationships. And it's helpful for the committee also to have a few words of rationale. Why would a particular referee be appropriate? Because of particular disciplinary expertise or whatever.
Just one comment here. On occasion, we run into situations where someone has been selected, and we believe primarily because of their administrative role. So sometimes we've had people selected because they're the dean of something or other. But often deans have been out of the research loop for a while. So it's not one's administrative standing that's relevant, it's one's actual research, contemporary research expertise.
Right, yeah. I mean, a dean will have read a lot of files, but that doesn't mean they're qualified to assess the quality of this individual's work. That's the point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, members list due process for selection. That's 30.8.6 to 30.8.9. The CA spells out that at least half of the required number of referee letters have to come from the list of names proposed by the member, and at least one of the referees' letters that ends up in the file has to come from the list proposed by the committee. So, going back to the renewal, that would mean that since at least half of 3 is 2, two of the names chosen from the longer dual list. We've got a members list, we've got a committees list. Two of the 3 have to come from the members list. One of them has to come from the committees list. For tenure and promotion to associate, it could be 2 and 2. And for promotion to professor, it would be 3 from the members list and 2 from the committees list, or at least 1, but possibly 2 from the committees list. I find sometimes committees don't seem to take seriously their role in coming up with names and choosing members from their own list. Committees often basically choose, and indeed that's the reason why we put in the requirement that at least one of the names has to come from the committee's list. In the prior iteration, a lot of committees would simply choose all the names from the members list. And the point is to get some balance and make sure that the committee probably has access to a range of experience that's different from the applicants, and might come up with names that the applicant didn't think of, and that perhaps are, while the members list is presumably at arm's length, the ones on the committee's list might be at even longer arm's length.
Okay, two considerations. The first is that the arm's length requirement applies also to the committee. So the chair of the committee or other members of the committee may have, I have this friend out there who's pretty good, and et cetera, et cetera. And we sometimes run into that situation. The second situation, and it's a problem for some committees, though not others, is sometimes committees are not familiar with the area of expertise of the candidate, and they run into a problem, which I think I've repeated annually, namely that we had one committee who proposed someone who had been dead for 2 years.
They're not. They fail on a number of the criteria. Yes. They're not capable of making an assessment.
That's what you think. You haven't worked.
Okay, so member list, committee list, choose the numbers appropriately, and then it goes on to say if the committee cannot choose at least half of the required, well, it says at least half of the referees from the members list, which I'd point out is an ambiguity. It's not choosing half the members off the list. It's choosing half the required number off the list. But you don't have, if the members submitted 12 names, you don't choose half of them, 6. Anyway, I'm sorry for the digression. If the committee cannot choose half the required number from the members list, you need to ask the member to meet with the committee, discuss other names, and submit, go through the process again. And this is what was being alluded to that can turn into an iterative process that takes some time and causes delays, and hopefully doesn't come up too often, but sorry if it does. I don't know what else I can say. Yeah. Right. Okay. So then 30.8.9 is where it says the member shall inform the committee in writing of the nature of the relationship with all individuals nominated. So this is, this is both long lists. It's not just the number that will be actually invited. And then the next step is soliciting the referees' reports, and this is where the head comes in and actually writes the letter. It's suggested that once the committee has decided which names to use as its A list, if you like, the head should contact those people right away to get their agreement to be a referee, even though we don't have the application file in hand yet. So that ideally, that request goes out in August, or at least as soon as the names are available, even though it won't be possible to send the file out until, in fact, the file has been submitted from the candidate by August 15th. So once the referee letters come back, they get put into the RTP file, and this is the first time I'm switching from talking about the application file to the RTP file. And there is the provision for the referees to ask for the letters to be masked to preserve confidentiality. That masking comprises only blocking the letterhead and the signature block. It does not involve redacting the text of the letter as if it was dealing with the Afghan detainee situation inside. So the referee needs to be told, we will block your letterhead and signature block it, or if you so request, and that's the extent of it. In order to maintain that potential for confidentiality, I'd like to point out that it is not necessary for the committee to tell the candidate who will be asked to be referees. The candidate knows who's on candidates list and who's on the committee's list, but they do not need to be told which 3 or 4 or 5 people as individuals will be asked. So the candidate knows who the agreed possible referees are, but doesn't need to know who the exact ones are who are being asked The point being that if you do tell the candidate exactly which ones are being asked, and only one of them asks to be confidential, it's not rocket science to figure out who that is, right? So it's better to, as a kind of a feature of this offer we're making to referees to maintain confidentiality, consistent with the spirit of that, we wouldn't be making it really easy for the candidate to figure out who the confidential one is from. Granted, most candidates can probably figure out who wrote letters anyway because of context and so on, but that's another matter. Okay, any questions about that? All right, step 2, member's application file. So the member prepares the file. There's a specified list of components that will be put together by the member, CV and list of publications and teaching dossier and that sort of thing. And so before the member prepares that, though, they may wish to consult their official file, and it's up to the unit head to make that official file available to the member, and indeed to give the member a copy at the unit's expense, I believe it is, right? Of that official file, if the member so wishes. And that's basically on the request of the member. So then, the member puts the file together and submits it, and that hard deadline there is August 15th. And so the application file then becomes part of the RTP file. Questions? No. Okay. And then there will need to be duplicate copies made of the member's application file, because copies of that file will be sent to the referees, and it's up to the university to pay for that, the unit to pay for it. So if the member actually makes the copies, the member is entitled to be reimbursed for those copies. Okay, so now we've got a number of copies, and we're ready to go along with soliciting views. Now the third step is soliciting students' views, and there's a process for selecting students. There's no specified number of student letters required, and there are no specified limits of how far back in time to go in looking at class lists of students taught by the applicant. Obviously, more recent is likely to have a higher return rate, because students from years ago will be scattered, and perhaps their memories won't be as good, and their investment in the process won't be as high, and their willingness to write, therefore, will be less. So it's probably reasonable to go back, current and past couple of years, something of that order, couple or 3. But this is not specified, so it's up to the committee, and it may depend too on how many students the professor has actually taught. If they have large classes, the pool is obviously bigger. And so there's a process whereby the member gets to have some input into who is not asked. The member should be given lists of potential students, and the best way to do that, I think, is just to give them recent class lists and ask them to review them and to identify any who they wish not to be consulted. And there's a limit on how many may be stricken. I think is it a quarter that may be stricken?
25%.
25%, yeah. So the member is allowed to kind of, without reason, strike out up to a quarter of the names presented. So for that reason, it's better to give them the full class list to make the potential pool big, let them strike 25%, and then pick the students you're going to request letters from the unstricken list. And then the committee writes letters to the students, committee chair. I should say, there are template letters for communications with referees and students and colleagues, and we provide those to you. Okay, so then when the student letters come back, they get put into the file. They are all to be masked, again, by removing signature blocks, and as many of them come in by email, don't forget to take the email address out. When the file eventually comes forward to the from the dean to the upper administration, the original letters should be included, but the original letters should not be shown to the candidate. So the candidate should only be given access to masked letters. I should say, to clarify that, this is handled in the dean's office, but usually the original letters with the signatures are put in an envelope, and the masked letters may be in the file, but the candidate is not to see the signed student letters. How many to write? I always say, how many students to request? I always say that in my experience, the return rate may be sort of one out of 5 or lower. So if you want a reasonable number of letters, you've got to write to quite a lot of students, perhaps 100 or more, to get a statistically reasonable sample return. Okay? Yep.
Can I just add that sometimes there is no reasonable rate of return, and so there can be less than that as well. It's just that that's what you're suggesting in order to try to get a reasonable rate of return.
Yeah, I mean, we can't make them right, and so the only way you increase the likelihood of getting more back if you ask for more. The returns are self-selected, either people willing to praise or people who have a real bone to pick. So the weight we give to these involves some judgment by the committee and by everyone else making the recommendations up the chain.
I should say here, in the collective agreement, with the interpretation of USAT, there is a statistical reliability requirement. There is no statistical reliability requirement for the assessment of student letters. You assess what you get.
Right. That's the best we can do. Okay, so moving on to solicitation of colleagues' opinions. The CA in 3011 defines what colleagues are. So colleagues are people in the, you gotta turn it over. Colleagues includes current members, that is capital M bargaining unit members, and non-bargaining unit clinical faculty within the unit, but it does not include members of the committee or department heads or deans or associate deans, and it does not include students. It doesn't mention emeritus faculty, but we've agreed, I think the parties have agreed, that emeritus faculty are not colleagues for this purpose. It doesn't actually say that. That's just a practice we've jointly come to. And so, it's defined. I have seen files over the years where an associate dean who happens to be a member of the department writes as a member of the department. Well, that is not appropriate. They're expressly excluded. The point being, especially if they're an associate dean in the same faculty, they're part of the dean's office. They are part of the collective process at a later stage, and they should not be playing a role at this earlier stage. Members who write, colleagues who write, are supposed to review the member's application file before writing. It's not supposed to be just a off the top of the head personal opinion of colleague X. It's supposed to be based on the file submitted. Okay? And those letters, colleagues' letters, are signed openly. They're not to be masked. Okay, then there's addition of material from the official file. This is a responsibility of the unit head, department head, or dean in a non-departmentalized faculty. So the unit head is supposed to go through the official file and pull out material or identify material which they believe is relevant to the application. This must include the USAT summaries, which are in the file. Perhaps not the entire career collection going back to the year dot, but a relevantly recent number of years, such as 3 to 5, something like that is perhaps relevant. And so it's the head's responsibility to put those in the file. Members also put USAT information in their teaching dossier, but that is not the same as the requirement that the head put the teaching USATs from the official file in. The head doing that will put in a complete set. Members don't always put in a complete set. They don't always put in the actual summary. Sometimes they collect selected responses to particular questions and put them in a table. So the full picture is given by the actual USAT summaries. So that's what should be put in by the head. Material from the official file that shouldn't go in, well, we've agreed over the years that annual reports and annual assessments of performance should not go in, given that those are well, the annual reports are snapshots of short time periods, and they are in effect replicated in toto in context within the CV. And the annual performance appraisal by the head is a formative appraisal rather than a summative appraisal, and so it's not really relevant to this summative process that we're engaged in here. Okay. So before the material goes into the RTP file, the head tells the member what the head is proposing to put in. The member has an opportunity to respond and say, yes, I agree, or I object to that, and why. And the way of dealing with that is mentioned. So there's a 10-day period for the applicant to review the material before it goes in the file. Once that material is in the file, and the colleague letters are in the file, and the referee letters are in the file, and the student letters are in the file, and the application file is in the RTP file, that's it. That's the RTP file to date. It is then ready to be transmitted to the committee for its evaluation, review, and recommendation process. And that is supposed to be done by November 15th or earlier if possible, but November 15th is the specified date. And with that, unless there are more questions, that brings us to the end of workshop stage 1.
Just want to point out on that.
If there are other questions.
The one thing I would just point out, unsolicited material. Yeah. Anybody who writes to the chair of the committee with an opinion that they would like to see go in the file should not succeed unless that opinion has been solicited properly through the process, whether it's a colleague or a student. So unsolicited material cannot go into the file.
On the other, that's true. On the other hand, members often do get unsolicited letters of testimonial from students, and they may put those in as part of their teaching dossier, and so we often do see collections of very nice thank you letters and so on that are in the teaching dossier, but it's part of the application file, not the RTP file. I've also seen cases where it appears, or it's obvious, that a member actually solicited a bunch of unsolicited testimonials. There's one case that I saw this year where there were about 25 letters, all very highly complimentary. They all had dates in a 2-day period in August. And it defies the imagination to imagine that those could have been random unsolicited testimonials. That is inappropriate, and that's something heads could mentor applicants about, is that it is not appropriate for the member to be soliciting things that they're going to be planning to put in their file. David.
What about the member including referees' letters from tri-council grants? Those weren't solicited directly by the folks that are anonymous. They're directly reviewing members' grant proposals.
Well, I mean, it'll come down to, I don't think there's a way of keeping those out. A member can put basically whatever they want in the teaching or in the submission. I think that arguably that's inappropriate use of a letter that the evaluator of the grant wrote the letter for a specific purpose for the use of NSERC or SHRC or whoever, not with the intention that it be used for this process. So it's actually an abuse of the letter, and but you can't stop it from going in. But then it comes down to what weight the committee gives it.
Yeah, I mean, my recommendation is to candidates when they come and ask is to not do that, but possibly to reserve it should, for example, the committee make an assessment that this person has never really consulted A, B, and C, and the candidate has this letter from a referee in the Tri-Council which says exactly the opposite. And that's used as a kind of defense in those circumstances.
So you'll never know who the letter came from. You just know that the Tri-Council letter is anonymous.
Yeah, but it may be anonymous, but it could be relevant evidence for when the candidate is given an opportunity to respond to concerns about the file.
Right.
I mean, this may be then relevant. That's generally my recommendation as a practice.
Keep your powder dry, is what you're saying.
Yes, I don't tend to use military imagery as much as John, but yes, I'll accept that.
Talking about baking powder.
I occasionally get students coming to me saying, I know so-and-so's going for promotion, may I provide a letter? I understand that they've spoken to other students where they've been asked to, they've been solicited by the committee to provide a comment, and they ask if they can do so. I normally refer back to it saying, did you receive an email? Did you receive a request? Well, I haven't, I've had a problem with my email, I've had whatever kind of thing.
Yeah.
I've always just said to them, unless you have received an official email, it cannot come to me unsolicited, it cannot be part of it. I normally send them to the faculty member. Is that okay to do that? Well, basically saying, if the request has to come from the committee, from me, you haven't received it, I cannot accept a reference or a comment. If you are gung-ho and you still want to follow that further to make a comment, I send them to the faculty. Is that appropriate?
Well, it'll be too late at that point because the application file will have been handed in on August 15th, and it's closed at that point. I mean, the member has the opportunity to add things later if they are sufficiently significant to affect the outcome.
Exactly.
And one unsolicited letter from a student is not going to tip the balance. So I would say it's not eligible. And
so I don't really have to send them anywhere?
No, I think you just say no. If you were not, there is a due process for selecting student referees. If you didn't get a letter, you weren't selected, and so no.
The person could be on the list of names that was struck out by the candidate, so you can't assume that every student is entitled to submit something. That's not the case. So
I think on one occasion I have said to the student, well, check your email. If you seriously do have problems, dash me an email and tell me that I can check my list to see who was sent off. Right. But I rarely ever get it to that point. They usually just drop it.
Right. Yeah, you could.
But I just want to make sure I don't have to. I don't have an obligation to.
No, I think your action is perfectly right. It just that I'd be more firm about it. And don't send them to the member because it is too late by then, right?
Well, at that point it is, and I've always said
so don't give them.
Isn't acceptable in the file.
What you're doing is sort of giving them creating the impression that there might be a way, and in fact there technically is not a way.
They don't normally really stress at that point, but occasionally that has happened. I've really sent them to the prof very often, but I just want to make sure that I don't have an obligation to do so.
No, I mean check the.
Drop it right in the track right there.
I think the point about the mislaid email is valid. So you could check the list, and if they're on the list, send them mail again. But otherwise, no. Okay. Any others? Yeah.
Just with the candidates list and the referees and the committees list, and one has to be from the committees list. If in fact the one that the committee wants to choose from their list is also on the candidates list, can they still choose that?
Yeah, that's okay.
If it's on both, they can still, if that
that's okay.
feels that's the best person, they can still choose.
Yep. That's okay. But I mean, I would hope that I mean, the committee doesn't have to make its list until it's actually seen the candidates list. So ideally, they would be trying to broaden the scope rather than create an overlap. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Yes, by official file, do you want it in the faculty office or the one we keep in the department?
Well, in a departmentalized faculty, the official file can have two parts. So the one there may be part of it in the head's office and part of it in the dean's office, or in some faculties there may only be one. I think applied science keeps the whole file in the dean's office, but in arts and science there would be part in the heads and part in the deans, and you have to, you want to look at both. It's the whole thing collectively is the official file. Okay, so I hope that gets you smoothly to the point where the file's ready for the committee to engage with, and that's the topic of part 2, which we do usually in late September, picks it up there, and deals with how the committee engages with the file, how the head engages with the file, and so on.